At first, it looked like nothing. Just another trench photograph from the First World War. Mud, helmets, sandbags, men packed into a ditch carved out of the earth. The kind of image historians file away by the thousands, because war produced so many scenes like this that even horror started to look routine. But this one didn't stay routine for long, because when somebody finally enlarged the image and looked into the lower corner of the frame, the whole photograph turned into something else. There, half in shadow, sat a soldier with a smile on his face. Not a polite little smile. Not the kind of accidental expression you catch for half a second when somebody says something off camera. This was wide, open, fixed. His eyes were stretched too far, like he was looking straight through the lens and past the man holding the camera. Behind him, other soldiers were bent over a wounded comrade. Their bodies were tense, urgent, focused. The trench itself looked like hell, the kind of wet, cratered misery men wrote home about, and then immediately softened, because the truth was too ugly for paper. And in the middle of that, one soldier sat there grinning like he'd wandered in from another world. That's the detail that got Dr. Thomas Avery stuck. In the spring of 2018, Avery was working through a set of digitized First World War images linked to a regional military archive in London. He specialized in combat photography from the Western Front, which means he had spent years staring at old images most people can only handle for a few minutes at a time. Collapsed dugouts, men sleeping in slime, stretcher teams moving through wrecked fields, faces that looked about 60 and were actually 19. He knew what trench fatigue looked like. He knew what staged propaganda photos looked like too. But this one bothered him in a different way. The original caption identified it as a British trench scene near Monchy-le-Preux in April 1917 during the Arras offensive. On paper, nothing about it sounded especially unusual. A routine battlefield image, medical attention being given to the wounded, frontline conditions documented by an official photographer. End of story. Except it wasn't the end of the story, because the longer Avery stared at that soldier in the corner, the less the expression looked human in any normal sense. It didn't read like happiness. It didn't even read like relief. It looked detached, wrong, like the face and the moment had become disconnected from each other. And once he saw that, he couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. Here's the thing people forget about old photographs. We treat them like clean evidence, little windows into the past, as if they simply show us what happened. But a photograph also traps things nobody meant to explain. A gesture, a stare, a hand clenched tighter than it should be, something half visible at the edge of the frame that means more than the official subject ever did. That's what happened here. The wounded man in the middle may have been the reason the shutter clicked. The smiling soldier in the corner was the reason the image survived in Avery's mind. And once he began digging, the story around that face started opening up in a way that was hard to shake. The trench scene came from the fighting east of Arras in 1917, one of those offensives people summarize in a sentence, and soldiers endured one shell at a time. Men in that sector lived under relentless artillery pressure. That matters. More than almost anything else, it matters. Because when people think about the First World War, they still tend to imagine rifles, charges, whistles, heroic leaps over the top. But the war that destroyed minds was, more often than not, a war of artillery. Shells you never saw fired. Explosions you couldn't fight back against. Noise so repetitive and violent that it stopped feeling like sound and started feeling like weather or fate. You'd hear the approach first. That awful rising shriek, familiar enough that men learned to count the seconds without even trying. Then impact. Mud in the mouth. Dirt raining into collars, boards splintering, somebody screaming, somebody not screaming. Then the horrible pause afterward, when everyone checked whether they still had their own arms, their own legs, their own hearing. And just when your body started trying to believe it had survived, another shell came in. That cycle didn't happen once or twice. It happened for hours, for days. Sometimes long enough to erase the boundary between waiting and living. So when Avery looked at the smiling soldier, he wasn't really looking at one isolated expression anymore. He was looking at what prolonged bombardment does to a nervous system. Back in 1917, soldiers had their own words for it. Nerves gone, shaken, gone queer, done in. By then, the term shell shock had already started circulating, not as a tidy diagnosis, but as a field description, the kind of phrase men use when something is happening all around them and the official language hasn't caught up yet. It covered a mess of symptoms because the war itself produced a mess of symptoms. Tremors, collapse, muteness, blindness without obvious injury. Panic, vacant staring, nightmares, paralysis, men who could no longer hold utensils, men who forgot how to speak, men who jumped at every sound, men whose bodies stayed in the trench long after their minds had started slipping out of it. And sometimes, men whose faces did things that made no sense at all. That part doesn't get talked about enough. We're comfortable with the image of the shaken soldier, the haunted stare, the 1,000-yard look before anybody even called it that. But the human mind, under unbearable pressure, doesn't always present itself neatly. Sometimes it scrambles the wiring. You laugh at the wrong thing, cry when nothing obvious has happened, smile during horror because your emotions have stopped obeying the world around you. It looks grotesque because it is grotesque. Not morally, medically, psychologically. The face becomes disconnected from reality. That was the possibility Avery couldn't get away from. The photograph itself made it worse. The smiling soldier wasn't helping the wounded man. He wasn't reacting to the others. He was just sitting there, legs bent awkwardly in the trench mud, mouth open in that rigid, unnatural grin, as if some invisible switch inside him had jammed in the wrong position. Nobody in the frame seemed to be looking at him. And that may be the darkest detail of all. Because the wounded man in the center received attention, bandages, hands on shoulders, concern. His suffering was legible. It fit the old rules. Blood could be understood. Shrapnel wounds could be admired, pitied, recorded. They meant something the military system recognized. But a man whose mind had come apart in front of everybody? That was harder, more threatening, more easily ignored. And ignored is often exactly what happened. Avery started reading medical reports, court records, officers' memoranda, letters from military doctors, anything that would tell him how breakdown was seen during that phase of the war. The pattern was ugly but not surprising. Shell shock was real enough to be noticed and doubted at the same time. Some doctors recognized it as a consequence of prolonged bombardment and mental trauma. Others, especially higher up the chain, treated it as weakness, malingering, or failure of character. There was a whole moral panic around invisible wounds. If a soldier had a broken leg, nobody needed persuading. If he trembled uncontrollably but had no obvious physical damage, suspicion entered the room almost immediately. That's how cruel systems usually work. They trust injuries they can point at. By the middle of the war, tens of thousands of British soldiers had been treated for serious nervous collapse. Official numbers caught only part of it. Plenty of men never entered the record cleanly. Some were patched up and sent back. Some were shamed into silence. Some were punished under military law when what they really needed was removal from the line, rest, and recognition that their minds had been battered just as hard as any body hit by metal. Decades later, that truth would finally begin to sink in publicly. But in 1917, it was still trapped under layers of pride, denial, and institutional fear. Which brings us back to the photograph. Avery became convinced that what the camera had caught in that trench was not cheerfulness, not a joke, not a quirky moment of wartime levity. It was collapse, a mind blown off course by too much bombardment, too much sleeplessness, too much terror with nowhere to go. The smile wasn't happiness, it was misfiring. The photograph was filed under a generic trench description, not an individual unit role. Records from the war are extensive until they suddenly aren't. And exhaustion so deep it stopped being ordinary tiredness and started feeling like a chemical breakdown of the self. There are letters from that offensive that read like men trying to describe weather inside their own skulls. One officer wrote that after continuous shelling, his men no longer ducked properly because they had used up the reflex. Another described soldiers sitting still after near misses, not out of bravery, but because something in them had simply gone flat. That's what the smiling soldier may have looked like a few minutes before the shutter clicked, or a few hours before, or maybe for days. And here's the part that really stays with you. We don't know his name. That always sounds dramatic when people say it, but in this case it's just true in the most frustrating way possible. The surviving caption identifies the battle area, not the men. The photograph was filed under a generic trench description, not an individual unit role. Records from the war are extensive until they suddenly aren't. Fire, bombing, sloppy paperwork, mass death, reorganizations, transfers, missing files, unnamed images. History preserves mountains of detail and still loses the person at the center of the most haunting frame. So all Avery had was the face. A face preserved for more than a century, digitized and enlarged by modern eyes, now telling a story nobody in 1917 wanted to tell clearly. Not the state, not the press, not the comforting version of wartime memory that prefers brave endurance over psychological ruin. The photograph doesn't let you hide in that older narrative. It says, no, look closer. War did this too. It didn't just tear flesh, it tore perception. It warped the mind until a man could sit in a trench beside suffering and smile because the machinery inside him no longer knew what expression belonged to what reality. That's a brutal thing to admit. Maybe that's why it took so long. For decades after the war, nations built memory out of ceremony, sacrifice, and stone. The language was noble because noble language is easier to live with. Heroism, duty, service, glory, if you were feeling especially dishonest. But photographs like this one sat quietly in archives waiting for someone to notice that heroism wasn't the whole story. It never is. Alongside courage, there was terror. Alongside discipline, there was collapse. Alongside the visible wounded, there were men whose minds had been hit so hard by bombardment and stress that they emerged from the trenches altered in ways nobody around them knew how to face. Only much later did the broader language start catching up. The 20th century dragged societies, almost against their will, toward the idea that psychological trauma is not imaginary just because it doesn't bleed. Later wars forced that recognition again and again. Different terminology came into use, better frameworks, more compassionate medicine, at least in theory. But the old trench image remains powerful precisely because it shows the truth before the culture was ready to name it honestly. And what makes it hit even harder is the indifference inside the frame. Nobody is looking at him. I keep coming back to that. The wounded man at center commands the attention because his injury makes sense inside the old logic of war. The smiling soldier sits a few feet away, plainly not well, plainly not present in the normal sense. And the image suggests he has already slipped into that terrible category of suffering that people notice without quite allowing themselves to acknowledge. You can almost feel the social reflex happening inside the trench. Don't look too long. Don't think about what that means. Help the man with blood on him. Leave the other one alone. Still, the image hurts. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe they had seen too much already. Maybe some of them understood perfectly well what was happening and there was nothing they could do. That's possible too. War makes cruelty out of exhaustion sometimes. Not because people are monsters, but because they are out of reserves. Still, the image hurts. Avery eventually wrote that the most disturbing thing about the photograph was not the smile itself, but the possibility that the soldier had become invisible while still physically present, broken in full view and already slipping out of the moral frame. More than 100 years later, that's what gives the photograph its force. It isn't just a trench scene anymore. It's a record of something societies are still not very good at facing, even now. The invisible wound. The brain and nervous system under more strain than they can metabolize. The public discomfort that follows. The temptation to misread distress when it arrives in an inconvenient form. We still do this, just with updated language and better excuses. The soldier in that corner can't tell us his story. We don't know whether he survived the offensive. We don't know whether he was evacuated, mocked, punished, treated, or simply sent back into the line until whatever remained of him gave out completely. We don't know whether he made it home and spent the rest of his life waking to sounds no one else could hear. We don't even know whether anyone ever showed him that photograph later, or if he would have recognized himself in it. All we have is the expression. That fixed, impossible smile. And maybe that's enough, because sometimes a face tells the truth more honestly than an official report ever could. It tells us that the First World War was not just a story of bodies torn apart, but of minds pressed beyond endurance. It tells us that men were asked to live inside conditions no nervous system was built to survive unchanged. It tells us that what looked like weakness to some officers was often injury in its rawest form. And it tells us, with a kind of quiet accusation, that people have been overlooking suffering right in front of them for a very long time. So now when viewers find that old trench photograph and zoom into the lower corner, the reaction is almost always the same. Confusion first, then discomfort, then the slow realization that the expression isn't joy at all. It's evidence. Evidence of a wound that took decades to be named with the seriousness it deserved. Evidence that war reaches into places the camera was never really supposed to capture, and yet somehow did. That's why the image matters. Not because it shows something impossible, but because it shows something real that people once refused to fully see. A soldier in a trench near Arras in 1917, smiling at nothing, while the world around him came apart. And the hardest part may be this. If one photograph caught that much by accident, how many other faces in those archives are still waiting to be understood properly? And what else have we been looking at for years without really seeing?